Ava Sinclair knew the moment she stepped onto the plane that something was off. It wasn't the usual pre-flight chaos, the last-minute calls home, the shuffle of passengers adjusting their carry-ons, or even the hushed sighs of business travelers already weary from a day of meetings. No, this was something more insidious, something she had encountered before, in boardrooms, in restaurants, in the supposedly progressive spaces where wealth and status were supposed to erase the invisible lines drawn by those who refused to see beyond their own prejudices. She handed her boarding pass to the flight attendant at the door, a woman in her early 40s with sharp, calculating eyes. There was no hesitation in Ava's step, no nervous shifting, just the smooth, confident stride of a woman who belonged exactly where she was. And yet, when the woman took her ticket, there it was. That pause, that infinitesimal flicker of something just beneath her carefully constructed smile. It lasted no more than a second, but Ava caught it. She always did. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Sinclair," the flight attendant finally said, her tone clipped, polished. Just enough warmth to appear professional, just enough coolness to let Ava know that she was being evaluated. Ava nodded in return, her expression unreadable, and stepped forward into the first-class cabin. She felt the shift in the air immediately. It was subtle, the way conversations slowed as she passed, the way eyes flicked up from newspapers and business-class cocktails to track her movement down the aisle. No one said anything, no outright sneers, no gasps of surprise. But the weight of their attention pressed against her skin like static before a storm. She didn't falter. She never did. Instead, she moved with the same quiet authority she carried into corporate meetings, the same unshakable presence that had built her career, earned her power, and solidified her as one of the most formidable women in her industry. But here, power was supposed to come wrapped in a different package. Here, power was supposed to look like the man in seat 3A, Richard Langford, a seasoned hedge fund manager who had spent the last 2 decades making billions off companies Ava had personally rebuilt. He didn't even look up from his tablet as she passed, but the smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth told her everything she needed to know. "Didn't know they were letting just anyone into first class these days," he murmured to the woman beside him, just loud enough to ensure Ava heard it. Ava didn't react. She had learned long ago that responses only fueled men like Richard, men who thrived on the belief that their place in the world was not just earned, but inherited. Instead, she reached her seat, 2B, beside a man who was scribbling in a worn leather journal, his auburn hair slightly disheveled, his sleeves rolled up in a way that suggested he was more artist than executive. He looked up as she settled in, offering a polite, neutral nod. "Ethan Hayes," he introduced himself, his voice quiet but firm. "Ava Sinclair," she replied, fastening her seatbelt. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before adding, "I think they skipped you when handing out menus." Ava followed his gaze, realizing that while every other passenger had a sleek, leather-bound menu tucked neatly against their tray tables, hers was conspicuously absent. She exhaled slowly. Of course. She turned her head just in time to see Cassandra Wells, the lead flight attendant, pause at the next row, offering menus with a perfectly practiced smile. The service was seamless, effortless, not a single detail overlooked. Every passenger was given the same polished, attentive treatment. Every passenger but her. Cassandra never once looked in Ava's direction. Ava's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in calculation. She had been here before, in these moments where power played out in the smallest of gestures. This was not a mistake. This was not an oversight. This was a decision. The message was clear. You do not belong here. Minutes passed. The scent of freshly plated meals filled the cabin. Trays were placed delicately before each passenger. Red wine glowed under soft overhead lighting. The murmurs of quiet conversations resumed. Then Cassandra returned, stopping at Ava's row, but this time there was no warmth, no pretense of hospitality. "We only have one option left," she said flatly, barely concealing her disinterest. Ava didn't ask why. She didn't need to. She simply glanced down at the tray that was placed in front of her. It was sloppy, careless. The sauce pooled to one side, the vegetables wilted, the missing bread roll in absence more deliberate than accidental. It wasn't the meal itself that mattered. It was the unspoken message it carried. Be grateful you got anything at all. Across the aisle, Richard let out a low chuckle. "Attention to detail really makes a difference, doesn't it?" he mused, swirling his wine. Ava lifted her fork. She ate, because she had learned long ago that dignity was not in how you were treated, it was in how you responded. She heard the whispered comments. She felt the eyes lingering too long, the small conspiratorial smirks exchanged between those who believed they were in on the joke. She absorbed it all, letting it settle into the back of her mind, where she stored every slight, every calculated cruelty, every subtle attempt to make her feel small. But she did not react. Because the thing about power, the thing people like Cassandra and Richard always failed to understand, was that it was never about who had the upper hand in the moment. It was about who held the final say. Ava sat still, unmoving, her presence an unspoken defiance against their efforts to make her feel invisible. They thought they had won. They had no idea what was coming. There is a kind of humiliation that is not loud, not brash, not spoken outright. It does not strike like a slap to the face, nor does it sting with the venom of a shouted insult. No, the worst kind of humiliation is slow, calculated, and quiet. It is woven into the smallest details, the subtlest exclusions, the moments where a person is made to feel lesser not by what is done to them, but by what is deliberately withheld. And in first class, at 30,000 feet, Ava Sinclair was being erased. The absence of a menu was just the beginning. It was a single, seemingly minor omission, but Ava had spent a lifetime understanding what silence could do. It was never just about a missing menu. It was about the quiet confirmation that she was not worth the same regard as the other passengers around her. She was meant to notice, and yet, at the same time, she was expected to say nothing. Because to complain, to demand equal treatment, would be to become difficult. And difficult people never belonged in spaces like this. She could feel the unspoken agreement settling into the air like smoke, thick and unshakable. Everyone was complicit. The passengers knew, the crew knew, and not a single one of them moved to correct what was happening. Ava inhaled slowly, her fingers curling in her lap, as Cassandra Wells, the lead flight attendant, continued down the aisle, distributing menus with a carefully controlled smile. To some, she gave an extra flourish of warmth, a light touch to a shoulder, a soft chuckle, a murmured acknowledgement that their comfort was of paramount importance. But as she passed Ava's row, she did not pause. She did not speak. She did not so much as glance in Ava's direction. Ava's posture remained impeccable, but inside something cold and sharp uncoiled in her chest. They wanted her to feel this. She glanced across the aisle. Richard Davenport was watching her, his gaze lazy, his smirk knowing. The game had begun, and he was enjoying it. Must be an oversight, Ethan Hayes murmured beside her. He had noticed. Of course he had noticed. Ava exhaled through her nose, her lips curving slightly. Of course, she said, voice smooth, betraying nothing. But they both knew it wasn't. Minutes passed, the scent of warm food drifted through the air, the quiet symphony of silverware clinking against fine china filling the cabin. The meal service had begun. One by one, passengers were given beautifully plated entrees, delicate arrangements of salmon and filet mignon, wine poured with effortless elegance into crystal glasses. Every detail had been perfected, the kind of refinement expected from first class. Then Cassandra stopped at Ava's row. "We only have one option left," she said. No apology, no explanation, just finality. She placed the tray down with a touch too much force, the dish sliding slightly upon impact. Ava didn't need to look at it to know, but she did. The meal was sloppy, sauce pooled unevenly on the plate, vegetables wilted and dull, the bread roll missing. The silverware had been placed haphazardly, a stark contrast to the meticulous setting of every other passenger around her. Richard let out a quiet, knowing chuckle. Attention to detail really makes a difference, doesn't it? He mused. Ava lifted her fork, and she ate, because that, above all else, was what they didn't want. They wanted anger. They wanted indignation. They wanted her to make a scene so they could confirm what they already believed, that she didn't belong, that she was the problem. But instead, Ava simply lifted her fork and brought it to her lips, swallowing the insult with practiced ease. The game escalated. Every time Cassandra passed through the aisle, she ignored Ava completely. Not in a careless way, but with intent, ensuring that every passenger around her saw it. A refill of wine for Richard, an extra pillow for the woman in 4D, a warm, easy smile to the couple in the front row. But for Ava, nothing, a non-entity, a ghost. Ethan watched with quiet, simmering anger, his fingers tapping against the base of his glass. He opened his mouth once, twice, as if he might say something. But Ava knew better. This wasn't his fight. The other passengers watched too, some with polite discomfort, others with thinly veiled amusement. No one intervened. No one leaned forward and asked, "Excuse me, but did you forget her?" No one turned to Cassandra and corrected her. That was the real humiliation. Not just the way she was treated, but the silent approval of those who allowed it. And it didn't stop. The dessert course arrived, delicate and pristine, a carefully plated chocolate souffle for one man, a dish of creme brulee for another. Each tray was placed with careful reverence, the way one might serve royalty. But for Ava, nothing. Not forgotten, not overlooked, denied. The message rang clear. You do not matter. She sat still, hands folded neatly in her lap, as the world moved around her, as people who had no more right to be here than she did enjoyed their privilege without hesitation. Then, the final blow. Cassandra stopped beside her seat, finally looking at her for the first time since this flight had begun. You seem awfully quiet, Miss Sinclair, she mused, her tone carrying just the faintest hint of amusement. It was a challenge. It was a test. It was a dare. Ava met her gaze, unflinching, unbroken. She did not speak, because she understood the rules of the game. To react would be to acknowledge. To acknowledge would be to validate. Cassandra's lips twitched in satisfaction before she turned and walked away, convinced that she had won. Richard's smirk deepened. Ava remained silent. But as she stared out at the vast, endless sky beyond the window, something cold and final settled in her chest. They thought they had won. They had no idea what was coming. So tell me, what would you have done? Would you have spoken up? Would you have fought for a menu, a proper meal, a drink refill? Would you have risked looking difficult just to demand the respect that should have been given freely? Or would you have sat, as Ava did, waiting? Because sometimes silence is not submission. Sometimes silence is the prelude to reckoning. And when her moment came, it would not be subtle, it would not be quiet, it would be devastating. There is a kind of cruelty that does not need words. It lives in the spaces between them, in the glances exchanged over champagne glasses, in the unspoken agreements between those who hold power and those who enforce it. It is not shouted, not wielded with brute force, but rather dripped slowly, drop by drop, into the fabric of a moment until it becomes inescapable. Ava Sinclair was drowning in it. The atmosphere in first class had become stifling. Every smile, every polite murmur, every carefully measured act of service was deliberate, a performance in which she was not just unwelcome, but non-existent. Every flight attendant except Cassandra Wells followed suit, mirroring her careful indifference, their silence and unspoken endorsement. Some of them did so eagerly, enjoying the small thrill of watching power shift in ways they understood but never questioned. Others, however, hesitated, like Natalie Brooks. She was younger, newer to first-class service, and still carried the wide-eyed nervousness of someone who hadn't yet learned how to ignore things. She was the kind of flight attendant who triple-checked passengers' requests, who carried an instinctive politeness that hadn't been crushed out of her yet. But even she knew the rules, and the rules dictated that Ava Sinclair was not to be seen. Still, Natalie's hesitation was there. A flicker of uncertainty in her gaze when she passed Ava's row, the slight twitch of her fingers when she bypassed her during drink service. She faltered for just a moment when she delivered coffee to Richard Davenport and Ethan Hayes, her hands tightening around the tray as she glanced at Ava's empty table. She knew, but instead of correcting the mistake, she stepped away quickly, falling back in line like the others. Ava saw it, and she understood Natalie was afraid. Not of Ava, but of Cassandra, because this was how hierarchies worked. Cassandra had made the rules, set the stage, orchestrated Ava's exclusion, and ensured that every member of the crew followed suit. But not just out of cruelty, out of power. This wasn't just about humiliating one passenger. This was about control. Ava understood that better than anyone. But what she didn't expect, what caught her off guard entirely, was just how far Cassandra was willing to go. The first-class cabin was settling into its mid-flight rhythm, the lull between meal service and landing, where passengers reclined their seats, sipped their wine, and disappeared behind their tablets or the occasional conversation. Ava had trained herself to become still, silent, to let the storm pass over her. And then it happened. The flight attendant's cart rattled toward her row. Natalie was pushing it, her fingers wrapped tight around the handle, her shoulders stiff. Cassandra followed closely behind, speaking in low, clipped tones, instructing her on service. But Ava wasn't listening. She was watching Richard. He was waiting. She could see it in the way he set down his drink, in the way his smirk twisted, in the way his gaze flickered. Not at her, but at Cassandra. And then, the spill. It happened so fast that, to an outsider, it might have seemed like an accident. Natalie, moving too quickly, tripped. The tray in her hands tilted at just the right moment, and a torrent of scalding hot coffee tipped forward, directly onto Ava Sinclair's lap. The sharp sting of burning liquid soaked through her trousers, searing against her skin before she even had time to react. A gasp rippled through the cabin, not of concern, not of sympathy, but of entertainment, because this was the moment they had been waiting for, wasn't it? The moment where she would break. Ava did not break. She inhaled sharply, the pain sharp and undeniable, but she did not lurch forward, did not scramble for napkins, did not let the humiliation sink its claws into her. Natalie, pale as a ghost, froze. I'm so sorry, she stammered, her voice shaking, her hands hovering uselessly over the mess. Ava lifted her eyes, not to Natalie, to Cassandra, who stood there watching, unmoved. Richard let out a quiet chuckle. Well, he mused, swirling his wine, that's unfortunate. Ethan, who had remained silent throughout the flight, snapped his journal shut. Unfortunate? His voice was sharper than before, cutting through the cabin like a blade. Cassandra turned, the air around her shifting immediately as she forced a polite smile onto her lips. Oh, these things happen, she said smoothly. I'm sure Miss Sinclair understands. Ava met her gaze, held it, and smiled. It was small, controlled, a razor-thin expression of knowing. Cassandra's smirk faltered. Ava reached for a napkin, slow, deliberate, unbothered, and dabbed at her lap as if the situation were entirely unremarkable. The moment stretched, elongated, the weight of it pressing down on the cabin like a held breath. Natalie, still shaking, stepped back. Ava exhaled, set the napkin aside, and spoke. I need the crew phone. The words were calm, measured. Cassandra blinked, her expression faltering for the briefest of moments before her mask returned. I'm sorry? The crew phone. Ava's voice was silk and steel. I need to make a call. Cassandra laughed. It was a light, dismissive sound, meant to erase the gravity of the request before it could take root. I'm afraid that's not possible, Ms. Sinclair. Ava's fingers tapped the armrest once. Then she reached into her blazer pocket, pulled out a sleek black card, and held it between two fingers. Natalie saw it first. Her eyes widened. Cassandra, noticing her reaction, glanced down, and the blood drained from her face. The card was embossed with a single, unmistakable title: Aviation Ethics and Inclusion Director, Executive Division. Silence. Heavy, oppressive, final. Ava tucked the card back into her pocket and stood. She didn't rush, didn't demand. She simply moved, and every step forward was a reckoning. By the time she reached the galley, she didn't need to say another word. Natalie, still trembling, stepped aside. Ava lifted the receiver and dialed corporate. This is what happens when cruelty is left unchecked, when power is wielded recklessly, when silence is mistaken for submission. Cassandra Wells had made a grave mistake, and in exactly 1 hour and 42 minutes, when this plane landed, she would finally understand what it meant to be powerless. So tell me, if you were there, would you have spoken up, or would you have stayed silent too? Humiliation is a slow thing. It does not descend like a storm. It seeps in, unnoticed at first, before it coils around your throat and makes itself at home. It drips into conversations, pools in the laughter of bystanders, and settles in the space between what is said and what is merely implied. Humiliation, when done well, doesn't need to be shouted. It only needs to be felt. And now, at 30,000 feet, Ava Sinclair was feeling every bit of it. She had known from the moment she stepped onto this plane that something was wrong. The stolen glances, the forced smiles, the service that somehow never quite reached her row. The way Cassandra Wells, the lead flight attendant, had orchestrated her exclusion with such precision that it almost seemed effortless. Almost. But this was different. This was no longer exclusion, no longer the silent, subtle cruelty of ignoring her presence. Now Cassandra was making a show of it. Ava saw the way the flight attendant straightened her posture as she reached the front of the cabin, her expression practiced, her voice smooth and confident. This was a performance, after all, and like any good performer, Cassandra knew when the audience was ready. She cleared her throat just loud enough to hush the quiet conversations. Heads lifted, attention drawn, anticipation settling into the still air. And then she began. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice carrying with just the right balance of warmth and authority. "As always, we strive to provide the highest level of service to our valued first-class passengers." Valued. The word landed like a stone in Ava's chest. "As part of our commitment to excellence," Cassandra continued, her lips curling in a way that only Ava seemed to notice, "we'd like to remind everyone that seating assignments are carefully managed to ensure the best experience for all our guests." A flicker of movement, a murmur. Ava felt the weight of eyes shifting toward her, subtle at first, then bold. Some passengers merely glanced, their curiosity piqued. Others smirked, as if in on the joke before the punchline had even been delivered. And then there were the few, the ones like Richard Davenport, reclining in his seat, wineglass in hand, waiting, because he knew. He knew. Cassandra inhaled softly, tilting her head just slightly as she scanned the cabin with the air of someone making a polite observation. "That being said," she continued smoothly, "if anyone has found themselves in an unexpected seating arrangement, we kindly ask that you notify a member of our crew so we can make the necessary corrections." She let it hang there. Let the silence settle. Let the weight of implication do its work. And then, finally, she looked at Ava, just for a second. Just long enough. Ava did not move. She did not blink. She did not give Cassandra the reaction she wanted. But she felt it. Felt the tension coil in her spine. Felt the heat of quiet amusement ripple through the first-class cabin. And then, like clockwork, Richard laughed, a low, knowing chuckle deep in his throat, the sound of approval. "That's a fantastic idea," he drawled, swirling his wine lazily. "Wouldn't want standards to slip after all." The laughter grew louder now, bolder. A passenger 2 rows ahead chuckled softly, shaking his head. Someone whispered something, and another smirked in response. It had begun. Ava was no longer simply ignored. She was the joke, the show, the reason for their quiet amusement, their stolen glances, their thinly veiled delight. Cassandra stood at the front, her job complete, her message received. And nobody questioned it. Nobody asked, "Who is she talking about?" Nobody turned to Cassandra and said, "That was unnecessary," because they all knew, and they agreed. Ava's grip on the armrest tightened, her nails pressing into the fabric. It wasn't the first time she had been treated like this. Wasn't the first time a room had collectively decided that she didn't belong. Wasn't the first time someone in a position of power had wielded it against her, ensuring that she understood her place. But it would be the last, because what Cassandra, Richard, and every passenger smirking behind their overpriced cocktails didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have guessed, was that they had just humiliated the wrong woman. Ava inhaled slowly, steadying herself, the heat of humiliation burning deep into her bones, solidifying into something sharper. This wasn't anger. This was calculation. She exhaled softly and did what she had done her entire life when faced with power-hungry gatekeepers who mistook arrogance for control. She waited. Because what Cassandra Wells had failed to understand was that true power was never in the moment. It was in what came after. And when this plane landed, the world she had built for herself, this little kingdom of cruelty, this stage where she controlled the script, would crumble beneath her feet. So tell me, if you were there, would you have spoken up? Would you have shifted in your seat, uncomfortable with the way a woman was being publicly humiliated but too afraid to intervene? Would you have watched in silence, convincing yourself it wasn't your problem? Or worse, would you have laughed, joining in, reveling in the power of a group that knew it could do whatever it wanted without consequence? Because this is how it happens. Not in grand, violent moments, but in whispers, in looks, in unchecked cruelty. This is how someone is erased. But let me tell you something. Ava Sinclair was never the kind of woman who disappeared quietly. And in exactly 1 hour and 24 minutes, when this plane landed, they would all learn the cost of their silence. If you believe in standing against injustice, like this post, if you've ever been in a moment like this, if you've ever felt the weight of a room turn against you, if you've ever been the joke, the outsider, the one left behind, comment below, because your story matters. Because Ava's story is not just hers, it is ours. And it's time we start paying attention. Silence is often mistaken for submission, for weakness, for defeat. People assume that if you do not respond, if you do not fight back, if you do not demand justice in the moment, then you must be powerless. They believe that silence means acceptance. But Ava Sinclair knew better, because silence, when wielded correctly, was not surrender. It was a weapon. It was waiting, and waiting was far more dangerous than rage. From the moment she had stepped onto this plane, she had known that something was off, known that they were watching her, judging her. From the subtle shift in the gate agent's demeanor to the way her mere presence in first class had turned heads and tightened smiles, the signs had been there. Then came the meal service, the missing menu, the deliberate exclusion, the hushed conversations, the wine glasses raised in mocking toasts, the coffee spill that should have been an accident, but wasn't, and finally the announcement. Cassandra Wells standing at the front of the cabin, speaking in smooth, polished tones, ensuring that every passenger knew that seating assignments should be respected. That mistake sometimes happened. And then, the glance, the split-second flicker of her eyes toward Ava's row. That was all it took. The message had been received, and Richard Davenport had laughed. The others had chuckled too, the amusement rippling through first class like a cruel inside joke, a joke at her expense. Ava had felt the moment press down on her, heavy and suffocating, the weight of being outnumbered, the quiet complicity of those who knew but did nothing. They were waiting for her to react, to snap, to break. But she didn't. She did nothing at all. She remained perfectly still, her expression unreadable, her posture composed, because she knew. She knew that Cassandra wanted her to lash out, to argue, to prove her own undoing. She knew that Richard wanted her to protest, to cause a scene, so he could laugh just a little louder. She knew that every passenger who smirked at her discomfort was hoping she would become exactly what they wanted her to be. Difficult, unruly, angry, someone they could dismiss. So she gave them nothing. She denied them the victory. The weight of her silence filled the cabin, stretching the moment into something almost unbearable. Cassandra shifted slightly, her carefully composed expression flickering. Just for a second. She had expected more, expected outrage, expected submission. And when neither came, the moment lost its power. Ava turned her head slowly, her gaze locking onto Cassandra's for the first time. Not with anger, not with defiance, but with knowing. A look that said, I see you, and I am waiting. The moment stretched, the tension thickened, and then Cassandra blinked. She looked away first. And that was when Ava knew. She had won. Not loudly, not forcefully, but in a way that mattered more. She had let Cassandra expose herself fully, completely, without interference. She had allowed all of them to reveal who they truly were. Every whisper, every glance, every moment of willful inaction, they had shown their hand, and they had no idea what was coming. Because Ava Sinclair was not just another passenger. She was not someone who could be ignored. And when this plane landed, when she finally chose to speak, they would all regret ever thinking otherwise. So now I ask you, what would you have done? Would you have fought back? Would you have demanded justice in the moment, raised your voice, forced them to acknowledge their wrongdoing? Or would you have waited, as Ava did? Because silence is not weakness. Silence is strategy. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let people destroy themselves. Comment below, what would you have done in Ava's place? And if you believe in standing up against injustice, in using your voice when the moment is right, like this post, because Ava's story is not just about her, it's about all of us. And the next time someone tries to erase you, remember this moment and decide how you will respond. Power is a strange thing. People believe it is loud, that it must be wielded with force, that it is something you take, something you demand. But true power? True power is quiet. It is knowing when to act, when to speak, when to wait. And for the past 5 hours, Ava Sinclair had been waiting. She had endured the missing menu, the deliberately sloppy meal, the ignored requests, the public humiliation. She had felt the weight of their judgment, the smirks, the quiet laughter, the hushed voices dripping with amusement. She had heard Cassandra Wells' announcement, carefully disguised as a polite reminder about seating arrangements. She had watched Richard Davenport lift his glass in mock approval. She had seen every single person who had turned their head, who had whispered behind their hands, who had chosen to say nothing. And she had let them. Because this wasn't just their game, it was their test. A test to see how far they would go. A test to see how much cruelty they could wield when they believed they were untouchable. They had failed, and now it was Ava's turn. She stood, not rushed, not frantic, deliberate. The laughter had begun to die down, replaced by the gentle hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses. Cassandra was glowing in her victory, standing at the front of the cabin, basking in the quiet approval of her audience. She didn't even notice Ava moving. Not at first. Not until Ava reached the galley, her heels clicking softly against the floor. Natalie Brooks, the younger flight attendant, was standing there, gripping a tablet, her expression tight with something that looked like regret. She had seen it all. She had followed Cassandra's orders, but she had known. She had known. Ava stopped beside her, tilting her head slightly. "May I use the crew phone?" Natalie blinked. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to." Ava reached into the pocket of her blazer and pulled out a sleek black business card. She placed it gently into Natalie's shaking hands. The young woman glanced down and froze. Her face drained of color. Her fingers tightened around the card, her breath hitching slightly as her eyes scanned the words embossed in bold silver print. Ava Sinclair, Executive Director of Aviation Ethics and Inclusion, Corporate Oversight Division. Natalie swallowed hard. She lifted her gaze, her lips parting slightly, eyes darting toward Cassandra, who was still entertaining her audience, still relishing her little performance. Ava gave her a single patient nod. Natalie moved. She stepped aside without another word. Ava picked up the receiver, dialed the direct line. The ringing was soft, steady. Then, "Corporate office, this is James speaking." Ava smiled slightly. "James?" she said, her voice smooth, composed. "This is Ava Sinclair." A sharp inhale on the other end. "Miss Sinclair." The man's voice shifted immediately, from polite professionalism to something urgent. "We weren't expecting your call until tomorrow." A pause, then, "I take it something has happened?" Ava turned slightly, her gaze sweeping across the first-class cabin. Cassandra still hadn't noticed. Richard was still smirking. Passengers were still whispering. She exhaled slowly. "Yes," she murmured. "Something has happened." The line went silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then, "What do you need?" Ava's smile didn't falter. "I need direct authorization," she said, "and I need it now." James hesitated. "Do I need to inform?" "No." Her voice cooled. "Just put it through." Another pause, then a soft click. Authorization granted. Ava placed the phone back into its cradle, straightened her blazer and turned. And then Cassandra saw her. Her smile wavered, a flicker of confusion, a shift in her carefully crafted mask. And before she could stop her, before she could even react, Ava picked up the intercom and spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying through the cabin, steady and sharp and unmistakable. The conversation died instantly. Eyes snapped toward her. Cassandra's lips parted slightly. Richard set his glass down with a slow, measured movement. I would like to personally thank the staff on this flight, Ava continued, smooth as glass, for their hospitality. A few passengers shifted. Someone coughed. Ava let the silence stretch. Let them feel the weight of it. Let them sit in the discomfort of knowing they had participated. She tilted her head slightly. And for providing a perfect first-hand example of the exact issue I was scheduled to discuss with corporate leadership tomorrow. The entire cabin went still. Cassandra's breath hitched. Ava continued, her voice never once faltering. For those of you who don't recognize my name, she said, allow me to introduce myself properly. A pause. Let them feel it. Let them drown in it. Ava Sinclair, Executive Director of Aviation Ethics and Inclusion. The gasp that followed was audible. Richard stiffened. Cassandra's face went white. I was scheduled to meet with the CEO tomorrow, Ava said, to discuss ongoing concerns regarding customer experience and discrimination policies. She smiled, razor sharp. But it seems I've already found my case study. Dead silence. Cassandra looked sick. Passengers were glancing at each other, eyes wide, panicked. Because now they understood. Now they knew that Ava had never been powerless. She had been watching, recording, waiting. And now, the very woman they had humiliated was the one who held their futures in her hands. Ava took a slow step forward. This flight will land in exactly 1 hour, she said, voice like steel wrapped in silk. Upon arrival, I will be meeting with airline leadership to discuss the events that have taken place today. Cassandra staggered slightly. Passengers held their breath. And then finally, Ava lowered the intercom, her gaze sweeping across the cabin, pausing on every single person who had laughed, who had whispered, who had chosen to stay silent. Then softly, deadly, she said the last words they would ever want to hear. We'll be having a very important discussion. And then she smiled. Tell me, if you were on that flight, would you have laughed? Would you have whispered? Or would you have spoken up? Because in that moment, silence was no longer an option. And for Cassandra Wells, neither was escape. There was a sound in the first-class cabin that had never been heard before. Silence. A deep, suffocating, terrified silence. Ava Sinclair stood at the front, her perfectly poised figure framed by the cold glow of the overhead lights, the intercom still clutched in her hand. The words she had spoken just moments ago still hung in the air, thick and unshakable. This flight will land in approximately 1 hour, she had said, her voice even, unshaken, absolute. Upon arrival, I will be meeting with airline leadership to discuss the events that have taken place today. She had paused, her gaze sweeping over each and every one of them, letting the weight of what she had just done sink into their bones. And then she had delivered the final blow. We'll be having a very important discussion. The power shift was instant. Cassandra Wells, who had once moved through the cabin like she was the queen of the skies, stood frozen. Richard Davenport, whose laughter had been the loudest, did not make a sound. And the passengers, the ones who had smirked, whispered, chuckled at Ava's expense, they weren't laughing anymore. A chill had settled over the cabin, heavy and undeniable. The very same air that had once carried whispered mockery and smug amusement now felt thick with fear. Because now there was nowhere to hide. For so long, Cassandra had wielded her power without fear of consequence. Who was going to stop her? She had played this game before, humiliated passengers who didn't fit the mold, bent the rules in favor of those she deemed worthy, and dismissed complaints with the smooth ease of someone who never thought she would face judgment. But she had miscalculated. She had picked the wrong person. And now, with the realization clawing at her throat, her entire world was crumbling. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of a seat for balance, her pulse hammering in her ears. Her thoughts raced. How bad was this? Could she fix it? Would an apology even matter? She dared to glance at Richard, the only person she could think to rely on. But for the first time since the flight had taken off, Richard Davenport, the man who had delighted in this as much as she had, the man whose quiet approval had fueled her confidence, wouldn't even look at her. He sat rigid in his seat, his fingers tapping anxiously against the arm. Rest, his expression locked in tight, controlled panic, because Richard had his own reputation to protect. His last name carried weight, his business dealings were vast, and his influence was supposed to be untouchable. But this was something he couldn't talk his way out of, because this wasn't just a scolding. This wasn't a minor inconvenience. This was a public reckoning. And the worst part? They had done this to themselves. Every smirk, every whispered insult, every act of humiliation that they had so effortlessly played along with had built the case against them. And now Ava was holding the gavel. The realization struck Cassandra with a force so violent she felt like she couldn't breathe. She turned back toward Ava, desperate, her lips parting. But what could she even say? I was just doing my job. It wasn't that serious. I didn't mean it. But every possible excuse died on her tongue because Ava wasn't looking at her. She wasn't looking at any of them. She didn't need to, because the silence, the terror in the air, was enough. The passengers shifted uneasily in their seats. Their eyes darted toward Ava, then to Cassandra, then to Richard, searching, waiting, terrified of being next. The laughter from earlier had evaporated like mist. The amusement, the smugness, the quiet pleasure they had taken in Ava's discomfort, gone. Because they all knew what was coming. The moment this plane touched the ground, they wouldn't just be stepping off another flight. They would be walking into a scandal, a full-scale, headline-making scandal. Their names would be in reports. Their behavior would be analyzed, scrutinized, condemned. And the people they had spent their lives looking down on would be the ones watching. And for the first time in their privileged, comfortable existence, they would be the ones who had to explain themselves. A sharp chime rang through the cabin, the captain's voice crackling through the speaker. "This is Captain Mitchell." The room tensed. "We have been made aware of a serious incident occurring on this flight." Cassandra felt her stomach drop. "We have received direct instructions from corporate leadership regarding the matter." The instructions. The corporate office had already been notified, the CEO had already been informed, and the verdict had already been decided. The captain's voice remained steady, detached. "Effective immediately, crew members involved in misconduct will be relieved of duty for the remainder of the flight." A hush fell over the cabin. Cassandra's breath hitched. The next word shattered her. "This includes lead flight attendant Cassandra Wells." No, it hit her like a physical blow. Her vision blurred. Her heartbeat roared in her ears. This wasn't happening. This wasn't supposed to happen to her. She had power. She had respect. She had control. And now, in the space of one announcement, it had been ripped from her hands. A sound escaped her, a choked, shallow breath, the kind that comes when your entire life implodes around you. She turned wildly as if looking for a way out, a lifeline. But there was none. She had built this moment herself, and now she was drowning in it. She staggered, her knees weak, her hands gripping the back of a seat. But no one helped her. No one spoke for her, because no one wanted to go down with her. The captain continued. "A senior investigator from corporate will be waiting upon landing." Cassandra went numb. "All passengers and crew involved in the reported incident will be required to remain for questioning." Richard stiffened. The passengers fell into dead silence. Because now the fallout was real. Now it wasn't just a warning. It wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It was official. And for the first time, Cassandra Wells, who had spent her career deciding the fate of others, was powerless to stop it. So tell me, if you were on that flight, would you have stood up? Would you have said something? Or would you have laughed, whispered, played along until the moment you realized you were next? Because power is only an illusion. And when the time for consequences comes, silence won't save you. Comment below, what would you have done? The moment the plane touched the ground, Cassandra Wells knew her life was over. It should have felt like relief. The smooth descent, the gentle bump of the wheels kissing the runway, the mechanical hum of the engines powering down. But all she felt was terror, because she wasn't stepping off a plane. She was stepping into a disaster. The other passengers sat stiffly, their previous arrogance and entitlement replaced with unspoken dread. The whispers that had once been filled with amusement were now frantic and fearful, darting glances cast between one another as they tried to prepare for the reckoning. And Cassandra? Cassandra couldn't breathe. Her hands gripped the armrest so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Her pulse pounded violently in her ears. She kept her eyes fixed on the seatbelt sign, watching, waiting, praying for something, anything to change. But there was no escape. The intercom chimed again, and the captain's voice cut through the eerie quiet. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to New York." Silence. "Please remain seated as we taxi to the gate. Upon arrival, designated airline personnel will board to conduct an official investigation regarding an incident that took place during this flight." Another blow. Passengers shifted uncomfortably. Cassandra shook. There was no ignoring it now. No pretending this wasn't happening. And then came the moment she had been dreading. The first class door opened, and there they were. A group of airline executives in crisp suits stood just beyond the threshold, their gazes cold, unreadable. At the center of them stood Daniel Mercer, the CEO, her boss, a powerful man, a man who never got personally involved in these matters, until now. His eyes scanned the cabin, landing first on Ava Sinclair. And when he spoke, when he uttered those 5 words, Cassandra's world collapsed. "Miss Sinclair, are you all right?" Not Miss Wells, not the flight crew, not anyone else. Ava, the woman Cassandra had humiliated, the woman she had dismissed, the woman she had treated like nothing. And now she was the only person in this cabin whose well-being mattered. Ava unbuckled her seatbelt, smoothing down her blazer with practiced grace, and nodded. "Yes, Mr. Mercer," she replied, her voice calm, professional, powerful. Her tone held no malice, no gloating. She had already won. Daniel Mercer nodded once, satisfied, before his gaze swept the room, turning to the passengers and crew who had participated. The silence grew thick, unbearable. His voice was like steel. "There has been a serious breach of conduct on this flight." Cassandra's breath hitched. And then it happened. The consequences. The thing she had always known was a possibility, but never believed would happen to her. "Effective immediately," Mercer said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Lead flight attendant Cassandra Wells is terminated from this airline." The cabin gasped. Cassandra froze. For a split second, her mind refused to process the words. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. No, this wasn't happening. Not to her. Not after 10 years. Her hands trembled, her vision blurred. Her stomach twisted itself into a knot so tight she thought she might be sick. I don't understand," she choked out, the words barely above a whisper. Mercer's expression remained impassive. "You will be escorted off this aircraft," he continued. "You will report to corporate for a formal hearing regarding your misconduct. Though given the evidence, your termination will remain in effect." The evidence, the recordings, the witnesses, the weight of it crushed her. But Mercer wasn't done. His gaze shifted. "Mr. Davenport." Richard stiffened. He had been silent for the last 20 minutes, gripping his armrests like they were the last thing tethering him to his dignity. Mercer's lips curled in disgust. "You have been permanently removed from our elite status program," he said, his tone clipped, final. Another shockwave. The color drained from Richard's face. His chest rose sharply as he took in a breath, his fingers twitching against the leather seat. "You can't," he started, but Mercer shut him down immediately. "You have also been flagged for internal review regarding multiple prior complaints against your behavior toward our staff." A hush fell over the cabin, because they all knew what that meant. Richard was finished. No more upgrades, no more priority treatment, no more first-class privilege. And worse, his name would be in every single airline's database. He was poisoned now. The realization hit him like a physical impact. His mouth twitched, but no one was coming to save him. Mercer turned to the remaining passengers. "All individuals who were involved in or encouraged this behavior will be subject to further review," he said, his eyes sweeping over them. "Your conduct on this flight will be considered should you attempt to book with our airline in the future." A direct threat. Some of them wouldn't be allowed back. They had participated, and now they would pay for it. Richard slumped back in his seat. Cassandra's body locked up. And then the officer stepped forward. "Miss Wells," one of them said, his voice clipped, "please come with us." Cassandra's breath hitched. It was happening. She had lost. The finality of it hit her like an avalanche, crushing her beneath its weight. She began to shake. She turned desperately to Richard, to anyone, but no one looked at her. The same passengers who had once cheered her on, laughed at her jokes, delighted in her cruelty, wouldn't even meet her eyes. She had become what she had once mocked, invisible, and the woman she had tried to erase was the most powerful person in the room. Cassandra Wells stood, her body trembling, her lips parting as if to say something, anything, but no words came. There was nothing left to say. She took a single humiliated step forward, then another, and as she moved, she finally understood. Power isn't given, it's earned, and when you abuse it, when you use it to destroy others instead of protect them, it will always come back to destroy you. Cassandra Wells had spent years believing she was untouchable. Now she was nothing. And the moment she stepped off this plane, the world would know it too. So tell me, was this justice? Or did Cassandra deserve a second chance? Would you have spoken up? Or would you have stayed silent until you realized you were next? Comment below. What would you have done? There was a moment, just one fleeting fragile moment, where Cassandra Wells still believed she could escape this. As she walked down the jet bridge, flanked by airline officials, her steps stiff and mechanical, her heart pounded against her ribs, surely there had to be a way out. Maybe if she explained herself, maybe if she pleaded her case, maybe someone would believe her. But the second she stepped through the terminal doors, that last sliver of hope was ripped away, because the world was already waiting for her. Bright, blinding camera flashes exploded in her face, turning the once dim terminal into a ruthless battlefield of light. Journalists stood in clusters, microphones raised, cameras rolling, their voices shouting over one another. Miss Wells, do you have anything to say about your termination? Mr. Davenport, how does it feel to lose your elite status? Is it true that you were directly involved in passenger discrimination? The crowd surged forward, ravenous, because this wasn't just an airline scandal, this was a reckoning. And Cassandra and Richard, they were the main event. Richard, for all his arrogance and self-importance, looked rattled. His usual smug demeanor had vanished, replaced with tight, controlled panic. His lips were pressed into a thin line, his jaw locked, his fingers digging into his briefcase handle so hard they were turning white. He wasn't used to this. He was used to control, used to commanding respect, used to being the one giving orders, not the one being dragged through an airport like a disgraced criminal. Cassandra, on the other hand, could barely process what was happening. She was dizzy, her ears ringing from the relentless voices, her skin burning under the harsh lights. This wasn't supposed to happen to her. She had spent years believing she was untouchable, that her title, her position, her connections would always protect her. And yet here she was, powerless, exposed, publicly shamed, because now the world knew. They had all seen it, the humiliation, the cruelty, the sickening abuse of power. And there was no escaping it. Then another voice cut through the chaos, calm, collected, unshaken. Ethan Hayes, the journalist who had been sitting quietly in first class, the one who had watched everything, but not just as a spectator, as a documentarian. And as Cassandra turned, her stomach plummeted, because there in his hands was his notebook, the one he had been writing in the entire flight, recording, observing, documenting every single moment. He stepped forward, his voice cool, deliberate. I assume you're aware, he said, smoothly, that this is already national news? Cassandra's breath caught. She hadn't even processed that possibility, that this wasn't just about losing her job. This was about losing everything. Her reputation, her credibility, her entire life. Ethan didn't look at her with malice. He wasn't cruel, but he was merciless. Because truth doesn't care about feelings. I've been covering corporate ethics for a long time, he continued, flipping casually through his notes, as if he wasn't completely dismantling her life in real time. I've seen people lose their jobs. I've seen scandals come and go, but this, he tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly. This isn't just a bad day for you, Miss Wells. His lips quirked up. This is career ending. Cassandra's knees nearly gave out. She turned, desperate now, to Richard, to the airline executives, to anyone who might still be on her side. But there was nothing. No support, no rescue, no one willing to defend her, because she had built her career on fear, not respect. And when fear fades, all that remains is the truth. She had been a name in the airline industry. Now she was a headline. Then came the final nail in the coffin. Ethan lifted his phone. Live. Streaming. Cassandra's heart stopped. "You're trending," he remarked casually, showing her the screen. Thousands of comments, people calling for a full investigation, demanding accountability. Cassandra shook her head. "No, no, no, no." Her throat went dry as she scanned the screen, the relentless flood of outrage pouring in from the world. "This happens all the time. Finally, someone got caught. Fire them, sue them, make an example out of them. I hope she never works in this industry again." She felt sick because this was so much bigger than just one flight. This was years of injustice, years of people being silenced, years of cruelty being swept under the rug. And now she had become the face of it. Richard grabbed her arm. "We need to leave," he hissed under his breath, his voice tight with barely contained panic. But there was nowhere to go, because standing just a few feet away, watching it all unfold with the quiet strength of someone who had already won, was Ava Sinclair. She wasn't gloating, she wasn't smiling, because she didn't need to. Cassandra's downfall was its own punishment. Ava simply watched, her gaze steady, powerful, unshaken. Because the woman they had tried to humiliate, the woman they had mocked, dismissed, degraded, had walked away with everything. And they had lost it all. As Cassandra stood there, frozen, drowning in her own disgrace, Ethan slipped his phone back into his pocket and nodded toward the cameras. "This story," he said, "isn't just about today. It's about every passenger who has ever been treated unfairly." His eyes flickered to the journalists, the crowd, the thousands of people watching. And then he said the words that would seal Cassandra's fate forever. "If you believe this behavior should never be tolerated," he said, his voice ringing with a conviction, "then like, share, and make sure the world never forgets." And just like that, it was over. Cassandra Wells had spent years believing she was above consequences. Now she was living proof that no one is untouchable. And the world was watching every second of it. The sun had just begun to set, casting golden streaks across the vast windows of the corporate headquarters. It had been a long day, one of the longest of Vivian Caldwell's life. But as she sat across from Daniel Mercer, the CEO of the airline, she wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't here for revenge. She was here for change. Vivian had spent hours watching Cassandra Wells crumble, Richard Davenport break beneath the weight of his own arrogance, and the once smug passengers shift in their seats, no longer so sure of themselves. But watching people fall wasn't victory. It wasn't enough. Not when there were still so many others who had faced what she had, people who had been dismissed, mistreated, humiliated, all because they weren't seen as worthy. This wasn't about just one flight. This was about making sure it never happened again. Daniel Mercer exhaled slowly, watching her carefully. He had seen plenty of scandals in his time, but none quite like this. He cleared his throat. "Miss Caldwell," he said, his voice more respectful than it had been before, "I know today has been difficult. I want to assure you that we will take the necessary steps to prevent this from happening in the future." Vivian leaned forward. "With all due respect, Mr. Mercer," she said, her tone firm but measured, "that's not enough." His brow furrowed slightly, but he didn't interrupt. She continued, her voice gaining strength. "You see, this isn't just about me. It's not just about Cassandra or Richard or even this airline." She let the words sink in. "This is about an entire system that allows people like me to be questioned, doubted, and excluded before we even take our seats." She watched as he shifted, processing what she was saying. "I don't want an apology," she said. "I don't want some corporate statement about diversity initiatives that gets forgotten in a week." Daniel's expression remained unreadable. "What do you want?" Vivian held his gaze. "I want policy reform." A flicker of surprise crossed his face, but Vivian pressed on. "I want this airline, and every other airline, to take real action." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table. Inside were proposals for bias training, new oversight procedures, stricter consequences for discrimination, and better protections for passengers facing mistreatment. Because this wasn't just about punishing Cassandra Wells. This was about fixing the culture that allowed her to exist in the first place. Daniel flipped through the pages, his lips pressing into a thin line. "I need to review this with my board," he said finally. Vivian nodded. "I understand." Then she leaned in slightly, her next words laced with quiet certainty. "But I also know that the world is watching." She gestured toward the screens in the conference room where news stations were still running the story, dissecting every angle. "The reputation of this airline is at stake. And more than that, so is your legacy." A slow, measured silence followed, and then something shifted. Daniel Mercer let out a breath, and for the first time, he really saw her. Not just as a passenger, not just as a woman who had been wronged, but as a force to be reckoned with. Finally, he extended a hand. "Let's fix this." Vivian took it, and just like that, everything changed. 1 year later, the next time Vivian Caldwell stepped onto a plane, it was different, not just for her, but for everyone. The airline had enacted new policies ensuring that no passenger would ever experience what she had. Flight attendants received rigorous bias training. Passenger complaints were handled with seriousness and transparency. And most importantly, there was accountability, not just for individuals, but for the entire system. Vivian walked through the first-class cabin, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she had to prove she belonged. She simply existed. That was the victory. Not revenge, not punishment, but progress. As she took her seat, a familiar voice spoke beside her. "Well, look at you," Ethan Hayes murmured, setting down his notebook. The journalist had been tracking the airline's reforms for months. Vivian chuckled. "Didn't think I'd fly with them again?" He smirked. "Honestly, I wasn't sure." She exhaled, looking around the cabin. The flight attendants were polite, engaged, professional. The passengers weren't whispering or staring. It felt right. "Things change," she said simply. Ethan tilted his head. "And what about Cassandra?" Vivian paused, then shrugged. "She's trying to rebuild her life," she said, "and I wish her well." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "After everything?" Vivian nodded. "People can change. I know that better than anyone." And she did, because change wasn't about taking power from others. It was about using it to create something better. The seatbelt sign dinged and the flight prepared for takeoff. As the engines roared to life, Vivian sat back and closed her eyes, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace, because she hadn't just fought for herself, she had fought for everyone. And in the end, she had won. The lesson and a call to action. This story isn't just about Vivian. It's about all of us. It's about the power of speaking up, about how one voice can spark a movement. Vivian could have walked away, let the experience make her bitter, sought revenge. But instead, she turned it into change. And that's what real strength looks like. So tell me, have you ever been in a situation where you were dismissed, ignored, made to feel invisible? If so, know this: your voice matters. Your experiences matter. And most importantly, you have the power to make a difference. Comment below. What did this story teach you? Have you ever witnessed injustice? How did you handle it? Like this post to show support for those who refuse to stay silent. Share this story so that more people understand why speaking up matters. And if you believe in justice, in fairness, in standing up for what's right, subscribe to this channel for more powerful stories like this. Because in the end, the way we treat people defines who we are. And when the time comes to stand up, which side will you be on?